Love your neighbor as yourself. Loving God, loving neighbor, loving self. It was a Pride Sunday. It was this last Pride Sunday that we gathered together and began this journey of worshiping together as two churches. And on that Sunday, we invited 4 people to share their coming out stories. And in the months since, we have heard stories of call. We have heard stories of sacred meals. We have heard epiphanies. In all of these stories, we have found that love of God and love of neighbor and love of self cannot be separated. They cannot be pulled apart. We've also discovered a truth that has been named by Trevor Noah, who said, "It is in the specificity of our stories that we find the most common ground." And so the question that we asked today of those who will be sharing, I'm so grateful for the 4 who will be sharing for us. The question we asked them was, when did you understand your racial identity? It is a question that we all must reconcile with as we seek to build the kingdom of God. Our first speaker is Reverend Jane Vennard. Jane, I invite you to unmute yourself and to share with us.
Good morning. It is an honor for me to share this story with you on this wonderful, wonderful morning. It was 5 years ago that I was at a conference, an international conference, and as in many conferences, there were a lot of people talking and I was doing a lot of listening. And we had an opportunity to choose a workshop. And there are always so many to choose from, but this time it wasn't hard for me because one of the workshop leaders was a woman I knew and I really appreciated her leadership. And I knew that our time together would be interactive and exciting. And what I didn't know was the title of this workshop, and I really just didn't pay much attention, it was called The Race Dance. Well, I like dancing, so I figured I would go to this workshop. And it was in this workshop where I, for the first time, discovered the openings of my own racial identity as white. One of the activities we did in that workshop that got me started and realizing that something was going on that I hadn't been aware of. And that was an activity where we paired up and said to each other back and forth over and over, I could tell a story about, and then the other person would say, I could tell a story about. So it would go something like, I could tell a story about my grandmother's racism. I could tell a story about dating a Japanese man. I could tell a story about my all-white high school, back and forth. And as we did this for almost 5 minutes, I realized that I had something going on inside of me that I hadn't recognized before. And so I sat with that. And after the workshop, I went up to the table. You know, in conferences and workshops, they have a table of resources and books and everything. And I went up to the table, and right in front of me was a book entitled Waking Up White. Now, some of you may know that book, but for me, looking at that, and on the cover of that was a picture of a little blonde girl smiling, probably 2 or 3 years old, at a table. And I thought, waking up white, and she looks like me. And it was that kind of sense, which is, what have I not awakened to? So I came home and I ordered the book and I started reading it. And I need to say that that book and that experience has really changed my life, because for the first time, I realized that I was white. I knew I was a woman, but I didn't know that I was white. I just took that for granted, and beginning to understand that with my whiteness came an immense amount of privilege. And so I began reading more about that, about white privilege, and working with that book and other materials. And then one day at church, actually, I shared with my friend and friend of many of you, Annabelle Clark, that I was doing some reading about white privilege. And she looked at me and she said, oh, you're talking about white supremacy. And I said, oh, no, I'm not talking about white supremacy. I'm talking about white privilege. And it was at that time I realized I had so much to learn, so much to learn. Now, this was 5 years ago. And now white supremacy and white supremacy culture and white privilege is all over the place. And it's wonderful to see it being spoken of. And it's also hard for me when I realize that much of the approach to looking at our own whiteness as white people is that it's all informational. And it doesn't seem to, for many people, and for myself included, I wanted more information, until I realized that there was a lot going on in my heart and in my spirit. And I realized that one of the things that happened to me in reading that book was I began to feel really embarrassed. And I was 75 years old and had never heard any of this stuff. And then I felt guilty that I was part of it, and I felt ashamed that I didn't know it. And I began to understand, with others' encouragement, that that didn't help anybody, that my task was to continue to open my eyes and wake up more and more. One of the things that happened to me was that I began to notice things around me. I noticed that most of my gatherings that I went to were all white. And I noticed it at the Parliament of World Religions, if you can imagine this. The opening session was done by 5 white men in 3-piece suits. Now, I wouldn't have noticed that before, I don't think. I would have noticed that they were all men, but I wouldn't have noticed that they were all white. So the noticing goes on for me. In fact, just last week, I was listening to a program from my college, and it was an interview, and it wasn't about race. It was about politics today. And I realized that I was shocked to see that both of the women were Black. And then I realized, well, why not? Of course. Of course. How many white men have we watched interview each other? How many white men have seen being served in the church, white men together with no women and no person of color? But I think the deeper understanding for me was that this opening of my eyes and this continued quest and search is a very integral part of my spiritual journey. That I have to notice what goes on inside. And just like spiritual practices, I need to honor what I'm reading, and I need to stop and reflect, and I need to see and ask that question, where is God in all this? So I have no answers to that question, although I know God is present. But for me, what I realize at this stage of my life, that this is the most important work that I could be doing.
Thank you, Jane. Wow. Yeah, connecting it to our heart. Appreciate that reminder. Our next speaker is Nina Severns.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was adopted at 3 months old from Guatemala by a white mother and white father who had adopted a Korean son 3 years prior. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, went to a public elementary school where there were few children of minorities in each of my classes from kindergarten through 5th grade. As such, my physical differences were apparent to me since before I can remember, but my racial identity was not realized until much later in life. As a transracial adoptee who had an older brother, I was cloaked in whiteness and exception from the time I was held within the arms of my white parents until I flew the coop. My racial identity is something that has formed as an adult. Because my racial identity was constantly in question, it was something that was very apparent to me, but something that was hard for me to understand. When I went to middle school, I was amongst a large number of Latinos for the first time. On a regular basis, I was surrounded by many people who looked like me. Although we may have had physical similarities, they knew that I was not like them. Since I didn't speak Spanish or live on the other side of the train tracks, I was told I was not part of that group and therefore did not share their racial identity. My racial identity was in question for a majority of my life. which makes this question of when I realized my racial identity very challenging. My racial identity has evolved over time, even though it was always abundantly clear that I was defined by my race. When I think about this question, when did I realize my racial identity? I think that it is really asking when I realized the impact my race has on the opportunities I have access to or not, as well as the impact my race has on preconceived notions of who I ought to be. The answer is as an adult, when I went to college and started to live independently from my parents, where I was no longer known as their child or my brother's sister, I started to be known for just who I was, taken at face value and experienced things without the cloak that for so long enabled me to navigate the world without the fullest understanding of my racial identity. It was further impressed, and I was eager to understand it when I was 19 and blessed with my biracial daughter, quickly realizing that I needed to be confident in my understanding of my racial identity to be able to teach her what her racial identity is and how it impacts her life experiences. Sometimes I question whether I really understand my racial identity in the fullest, as I was not raised to understand it in its entirety. I hope that I am able to impart the richness of being Latina and Black to my daughter, allowing her to be proud while always knowing, like I never did, that her race, while something to be proud of, changes the way she is seen within the world and may impact her experiences and opportunities.
Thank you so much, Nina, for sharing your story and all of your questions and being open to sharing those with us. Next, we're going to hear from Hillary Blair.
While I was preparing to speak to everyone, I realized how wrapped into this story is my father, who would be 96 this year. And a number of things come to mind. The first one being how horrible that I'm having this conversation, since when I was little, this is what he was fighting for. So the fact that we are still here having this conversation about race is so frustrating. And I feel like I was calling out to him going, I'm going to do better. I'm going to figure out how to have a stronger voice around it. And those who know me know that I'm always wrestling. And whenever I speak, I always say, please let me know publicly or privately if I say things that I am unaware of that are perpetuating the problem. And I say that again this morning. So please do let me know. My racial identity, I feel like I've always known I've been white because my father was really adamant about telling me that. And it kept happening and keeps happening. It doesn't mean I'm any more evolved than anyone else. And the big thing for me was when I realized what doors it opened that I had no idea of. So as a kid growing up in Massachusetts in a town that it's called Oak Bluffs, and it's like in the summer, it's a predominantly Black vacation spot and well known for that. So I was raised there and waiting on people, and I've had great discussions about like me seeing the Black culture as lawyers and doctors and judges and politicians, and aware that that was a certain lens, and aware that I had friends of different colors, and realizing also that it meant that I had a different experience simply by being white. My father would often say to me, remember to make eye contact with people of different color, to be aware that you are connecting. I know that as when I was living in New York City, I was really aware of making eye contact in order to say, hey, I see you. That was part of my journey. But that also made me realize, what is that about me that I'm making eye contact to say I see you? There's also that other side of that feels that's so white. And I lived in Brooklyn, and I had my stop was at Grand Army Plaza, and I used to joke in the sardonic way I do that I thought there was like a skin sensor, like the door opened my skin and I got off, and it felt like all the white people got off at that time. And there were so many reminders of the differences. So even though we were riding home on the subway together, we got off at different stops. And that's a metaphor I've used a number of times. And I think the big thing for me was when I came to Colorado and realized, for one thing, it was whiter than I had been familiar with. I had a class that I taught, and I would joke, I said, yeah, I have 5 tailors and 1 has dark hair, right? I was just like, this is a new thing for me. Like, I was used to having quite a diverse group. I taught Sunday school at Marble Collegiate in New York, and it felt like a world class, like everybody coming from everywhere with all their different ideas. And then I come to Colorado and dealing with that shift and how easy it was for me, right? Fit right in. So I had to be aware that I was uncomfortable, that there was no difference, but who would know that difference, and feeling that whiteness, and what could I do about that, and seeking out ways to connect with others and finding communities of color. I taught at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts for many, many years, and I was partnered with Salvador, this fantastic teacher. And he, at the time, was calling himself Latin. That was his choice. And we talked about Hispanic, Latin, and the other thing of using the term Black now and being aware of that, encompassing many, and still asking people what works for you, because that is a limiting label as well. So at the time, Salvador, that was what he was asking. And we were going to a lot of schools around Denver. We were heading to a school in Denver to do one of our workshops for theater workshops. And we are heading into a school that was predominantly native Spanish speaking. So in essence, I was to be the outsider. And as we were walking up, he and I are doing last minute discussions about the details of the workshop and planning. And this is post Columbine. So knowing that going into schools, they're more checking who we are. We're walking, and I turn and I open the door and I face forward and I turn back. And Salvador's gone. I was just talking to him. Where did he go? Literally, a door had opened for me that had been closed on him. He had been pulled over and questioned and asked who he was and why he was coming in. And I was let in. I'm the outsider. And I was walked in and no one questioned me. He and I talked about that somewhat, of course. It stuck with me strongly. Many of you have heard me speak of this story, because how do we be aware of what doors are being opened for us if we're not walking with Salvador every day? So how do I know that I'm being led in places and things are coming my way? How do I be aware of that privilege? How do I be aware of, even in a school where I'm the outsider, I was let in? And that's, to me, that's on my shoulders, in my lap, to keep asking questions and keep checking it out and keep being aware and understanding that the problem with privilege is we don't see it. The problem with privilege is that it's exactly that. We're not even aware that doors are opening, things are being handed my way, our way, whatever, simply because of the package we come in. I talk a lot about our packages. Packages matter. That's why they're huge branding companies, right? They know we care what packages we come in. And we have to, I feel like I just have to keep talking about it openly and ask, what am I missing? What am I missing? What am I not seeing? What door did I just walk through that you got slammed in your face? So super white, even though my dad was, look at my name, Hillary Blair, we can even go there, super white name. So we're like playing with those ideas of like, knowing it. My father marched with Martin Luther King Jr. My grandfather hired the first Black nurse in Cleveland, Ohio. The work is so not done. And I'm going to keep asking questions, and I'm going to keep stumbling, and I'm going to keep saying the wrong thing, and I'm going to keep trying to figure out what doors are opening. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. Thanks for those questions we all need to be asking, and for sharing your story. Our last speaker is Eva Gabel. You would unmute yourself.
Okay, good morning. I think I'm unmuted. Okay. So for me, I was born into a church with a large Hispanic ministry. So when I was at that church, I remember looking around, and I was one of the few families that were both white and non-Spanish speakers. So it was pretty easy to see when we were looking around at the other kids and the other families that I looked different and, again, spoke a different language than everyone else. So we stood out. And I remember that people treated me differently because of it. I was platinum blonde and blue-eyed, and I just stuck out. So I think I recognized that I did have a race pretty early on, although I did struggle with what that actually meant and what the implications of that would be. I still do that. I still struggle with that. But that's been something that's kind of slowly evolved over time as I've continued to interact with other people. There's a moment from my childhood, though, that does stand out for me in terms of realizing what race meant. It actually happened when we started doing standardized testing in elementary school. So by this point, I had learned enough family history to think of myself as 3/4 German, and I had family heirlooms, and I had pictures and books of family history to look through. And on rainy afternoons and during tornado warnings, Mom used to sit there with us with the photo albums, and we'd look at all these pictures of our old dead relatives that I'd never met, and Mom would tell stories about them. And I recognized that, and I recognized that we looked like each other, and I had this understanding of our heritage. I also knew that when people looked at me, they just called me white. So I had kind of two understandings of what I was. I thought of myself as German or white. Both of those worked. So where it became really confusing for me was when we got to those standardized tests, they asked us to circle which race we were on this Scantron. And I looked through the list of options looking for either German or white, and there wasn't one of those options anywhere on this list. They were something like American Indian or Indigenous, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and Caucasian. I had no idea how to answer this question. And so I think it was also the first time that many of us had been asked to formally answer that question. And so the teacher asked us if we had any questions about how to fill this in. It's pretty straightforward. You just say what race you are. And several of us raised our hands because we had no idea how to answer this question. One of my friends asked first. He was both white and from Africa, and half joking, he asked if he should mark African American. He knew that was the wrong answer, but he had no idea how to answer it. And so he didn't know. He said, "What do I mark?" And I raised my hand because I didn't recognize any of the questions either. I said, none of these are how I think of myself. And I remember our teacher told both of us just to fill in the circle for Caucasian. It means white, it's fine, just answer that one. The teacher was really uncomfortable by this point, and they then kind of went on to explain to us that we were supposed to mark the circle based on our skin color and not our ethnicity, which was a new term for me, because what the mysterious they who had created the standardized test really wanted to know was what color we were, not what our culture or heritage was, or where we were from, or where our families were from. And I think that incident was formative for me because I remember I was upset, first of all, how much they cared what color we were, but also I was confused because they weren't asking what color we were. I didn't understand where that line was drawn. And I remember being confused because I didn't remember hearing the term ethnicity before. That one was new for me too. And I didn't understand where the difference was there. I knew there was a difference, but I couldn't explain what it was. And I remember I was upset because I was told to call myself a term I had never heard before. And I was worried that I was going to answer it wrong or that it was saying something about me that I didn't know what it was saying. So I just remember being really confused and really upset in that moment. I don't really remember anything else about that test. But I do think that what was useful about that is it spurred this curiosity about what race actually was and what ethnicity actually was and what those meant for me, because I knew I was white, but there was more to it than that. And so I remember going home that night and just kind of excited because I had a new vocabulary word. I ran home and I asked my parents if they knew what Caucasian meant and that they knew that it meant white, because this was exciting and new for me. And that was the first time I can remember intentionally having a conversation about what whiteness was. And as my parents talked with me, they listed off all these other euphemisms that I also didn't know for what white was. And I realized that my race was a lot more complicated than I had thought before that. It had a lot more baggage. And since then, I've had a lot of conversations about race. It seems to be a topic I have trouble not talking about. But I think of this moment as the beginning of understanding really what my racial identity was, that it was more than what color I was, but that was so important that that's what people really wanted to know. And so it's been growing from there, but I think of that as the start.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you so much, Jane and Nina, Hillary and Eva, for sharing your answers and questions and wrestling with the question of what is your, or how did you first experience your racial identity?